and I will discuss some case studies from Deir el-Medina. In fact, this talk is based on my work in the framework of the Crossing Boundaries project, which involves the University of Basel, the University of Liège, and the Museo Egizio. This project aims to study heterogeneous papyri from Deir el-Medina kept in the Museo Egizio. And as you will see, I will mention several times in my lecture the TIPUP database, which is an online database about papyri in the Museo Egizio that we use and try to fill also for our corpus, which is the Ramesside papyri from Deir el-Medina. I will begin with the usual short introduction about Deir el-Medina. So Deir el-Medina is a site, an archaeological site in Upper Egypt, in front of the city of Luxor, so the ancient capital of Thebes, and it's the village where the workers who dig and built the tombs, the royal tombs of the Valley of the Kings and Valley of the Queens used to live during the second half of the New Kingdom. So here you have a view from Google Earth of the village, and you can see the village itself and the necropolis at the western part, just in front of this village. And here, of course, the usual view of the site from the digging house. The Ramesside papyri from Deir el-Medina were collected first by Bernardino Drovetti, who was an Italian diplomat working for the French government at the beginning of the 19th century. So Drovetti was with Henry Salt, this kind of diplomats who collected antiquities across Egypt and finally sold their collections to the new museum of his time, for instance, the Louvre and the British Museum, but also the future Museo Egizio. And especially Drovetti sold one of his collection to the king of Piedmont, Sardinia, in 1823. And most of the papyri from the Museo Egizio are in fact from this first collection of Drovetti. So they belong to the original core of the collection, and it consists of thousands of fragments, which actually were so here you have a view of the museum in Turin, were studied, and of course I have to say a few words this year about Champollion, were studied first also by Champollion when he traveled to Turin a few times. So he began also to understand more and more the cursive hieratic with his studies about the papyri from Turin. Few years later, or almost 1 century later, let's say, at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, another Italian scholar, Anastylosis Schiaparelli, also did some excavations in the site of Deir el-Medina, and he also discovered some papyri, which he added to the collection of the Museo Egizio. Then, starting in 1922, Bernard Brière, a French scholar working for the French Institute of Oriental Archaeology in Cairo, began to make excavations also on the site of Deir el-Medina, and he discovered also some fragments, tiny fragments, and more consequent fragments, which are now in the collections of the IFAO in Cairo. In 1928, another group of papyri from the el-Medina were discovered, the famous Chester Beatty papyri, which are now in the collections of the British Museum in London. So in fact, we don't really know where Drovetti discovered the first part of the papyri, except that they probably likely comes from the el-Medina, and now we have some joints with a later addition by Schiaparelli and Deir, so we know that it's the same, let's say, group of documents originally. But of course, at the beginning of the 19th century, we don't have any really any information about the archaeological context of the discovery. Drovetti at this time was more a collector of antiquities than a true archaeologist, let's say. Schiaparelli and Deir, for their own part of excavations, have documented the locations, but in a very large, let's say, way. So we are still trying to find more information about the original context of this discovery of a papyri. And in fact, we have some information inside the content of the papyri themselves that a library, a full library of, or let's say archives from the Ramesside times was kept inside the tomb of Amenart, son of Hipwi, who is a very well-known and famous scribe of that time, of the 20th dynasty. And the basic hypothesis is that a large part of the Turin collection comes from this tomb of Amenart. And the tomb of Amenart was identified by Deir in the 1930s, and is supposed to be in this place. So you can see in the blue square. So it's a huge, let's say, area that we call sometimes the Bechen of Amenart, and it's a kind of group of chapels with different kind of tombs, so a superstructure and a substructure. And in 2021, so last year, a new mission belonging to the larger French mission from the IFAO was directed by Andreas Dorn and Stefan Polis to try to study this area again and to check what Deir discovered and how what is the possible archaeological context of a Turin collection, or at least a large part of them, of a papyri. So the work began last year. So you can see on this view how it looks from the top. So you can see the superstructure with some chapels and a courtyard and some shafts which lead to the substructures. In fact, the original entry of the Amenart tombs was probably under the road here, and the other shafts belong to later additional tombs or previous tombs, as it is usually in the el-Medina necropolis. Here you have a picture of the site after the first season, and the Deir's plan of a substructure with all the different tombs mixed. And actually the supposed alleged tomb of Amenart is this one. So we did our own map, and the first results of the work we did in this mission will be published soon online. But there are still a lot of work, and we are still trying to prove the hypothesis, the original hypothesis, that this tomb is the original context of, let's say, at least the library of Amenart, because the Chester Beatty papyri, for instance, belong to another family archive. Well, I will come back to my main topic. So, as you can see, I use in my title the term anastylosis, which I borrow to architectural reconstruction in an heritage context, of course. Well, if you have a look on this definition, which just come from Wikipedia, by the way, and is very simple, you can see that it's a monument restored using the original architectural elements. So in our case, it's more papyri, but anyway, the same. And combined with modern materials, that's less the case with papyri, because most of the time we just try to keep the fragments, and we don't add any other material on it. But sometimes we can finally combine also the preserved part of the text with some restitution that we can expect because of the nature of the text and the parallels. As you will see, it's often the case, by the way. So you have an example here of what we can do from fragments in the Turin collection. I will come back to this example later, but you can see that from 3 fragments we can go to maybe a dozen of fragments with almost a page, and even the fragments of the next page. So this kind of virtual reconstruction is, in fact, one of the outputs of the Crossing Boundaries project, even if it's not the main topic of our research. But of course, when you work on thousands of fragments, at some point you try to make new joins. I used mainly Photoshop to do this process, but we are also, I mean, a colleague from Basel is developing a virtual light table, so a freeware, which will be really adapted to our needs, and will be a wonderful tool to make new joins and to reconstruct papyri in the future. If I come back to paleography, well, I used this very simple definition also. Well, I don't agree with the last part of the sentence, because actually the textual content of documents is interrelated with paleography, and you can't just ignore it. And for instance, in our case, or I mean in the traditional way we do Egyptology, we have a tendency to consider that the more the text is literally, the less cursive it is. So it means, of course, administrative texts are supposed to be more tachygraphic, which is often the case, but not always. Well, you have kind of some examples of different kind of texts we consider as literary or administrative in our field. Well, for instance, letters can be a bit in between, and of course it depends a lot of individual variability, which means a lot of things, and I will come back on this later. But the general rule when the text is more, I mean, less cursive because it is literary, has to be at least nuanced, let's say. Well, here you have some different kind of examples from mostly from Turin, of different kind of cursive. So first comes from literary texts, different kind of literary texts. I mean, the first one is a letter, and the other ones are magical text, and CGT 5411 is a copy of a satirical letter of Hori. And I also put a famous example, the Papyrus Wilbur, which shows how looks tachygraphical administrative hierarchy. Well, one of the questions I wanted to address in this talk is what are the aims of the use of paleography in hieratic studies. So in fact, deciphering historical manuscript it's already something, and in fact, I think everyone knows in Egyptology the hieratic paleography by George Muller, which is still in use and is a useful tool, even if it's a bit outdated, of course. And which actually is also used to learn hieratic when you are a student. So it's this case of a grid with all different kind of variation of signs. And here you can already see that most of the variation are recorded in the Muller paleography. So here it's the second volume about New Kingdom hieratic, but most of this variations are really nice ones, let's say, and the best, the most readable kind of hieratic you can have. So of course it's only one page, and you have other signs in the volume. But still it's a very limited work, even if it's still something we use almost daily, of course. So another use of paleography is, of course, trying to date historical manuscripts based on the assumption that the shape of the signs evolve for time, and that you can try to find some criteria about the shape of the signs to date from one period or the other. A very nice tool about that was edited by Stefan Wimmer, who had a kind of very systematic approach and used already dated by content ostraca, and try to show the possible evolution, or at least the different kind of shapes for one sign that we can have for time. But here also, in fact, so it's a very useful work also, but of course sources are limited, and the question of representativity is always something to address. One of the interesting point with the work by Stefan Wimmer is that he took administrative text only, and this administrative texts are allegedly more subject to, let's say, natural evolution or evolution in general about the shapes, when the literary texts are supposed to stay in a more traditional hieratic, which has not the same dynamics of evolution for time. Well, in the framework of crossing boundaries for my work, I use paleography for other things, at least mainly, let's say. So the first use I try to practice, let's say, is pre-ordering fragments, so classify fragments in literary and non-literary. But of course, this is something, it's a limited methodology, because most of the fragments are heterogeneous, so they mixed both kind of text and handwritings, meaning administrative and literary ones. And of course, it's not so simple because you have many handwritings that looks like a literary, for instance, but in fact have an administrative content because the scribe was just a good writer, or at least at that time. And that's what I said at the beginning about paleography. It's not so easy. You can consider that the cursivity is only is the only criterion to keep in mind. The other purpose of paleography in my case is clustering fragments to reconstruct documents or to make puzzles, and that's the main topic I will discuss after. And then clustering documents to identify the repertoire of a scribe or a group of scribes, so to make some scribal attribution, which is what I want to do and what I try already to do. So when you have all these documents, of course, you can identify different group of handwritings based on the shape of the signs and other things, and try to gather the documents to collect the texts that were written by the same scribe, or at least the same group of scribe, in order to make his repertoire, and to then to try to get new information about datation, of course, microhistory of a site, of people from the site, and the community of Deir el-Medina in general. So how to identify a handwriting? Well, I try to be to make something simple also. That's a very complicated questions, but in fact, the general aspect of the handwriting itself has some features, like it can be bold, it can have signs bent to the right or bent to the left, or a huge size, or this kind of features. And the shape of signs and group of signs, which is the main approach in traditional paleography, let's say, is also an interesting point, and I will give some examples later. And the ductus, so the way the scribe has traced, has drawn the sign, is also something that can be useful to identify an individual scribe. Also, the ductus maybe is more complicated thing to analyze and to detect based on pictures and even under the glass plate, and especially when the scribe has a very homogeneous way to write, and is not is filling the signs with ink in a very homogeneous way. Of course, beside that, you have other things that can nuance your judgment and your identification, and that can also shows kind of individual variability, which might be interpreted as something that lead to identify another scribe, or something that means that the scribe has variation in his own repertoire. So, for instance, we can consider that the same scribe can have a different handwriting from the beginning of his career to the end of his career. Of course, it's connected with the age, and why not with some sickness coming with age. Or also when a scribe is writing for a specific audience to be read, he of course will try to be to write a less tachygraphical hierarchic, The context, of course, so the context is the kind of text, for instance, and actually we can, and we know that scribes have a different way to write different kind of texts. For instance, they use a very tachygraphical style for administrative text and a very nice one for literary text. And in this case, the main question that can be addressed is to is to try to connect an administrative hand with a literary one, which would belong to the same scribe, and then to attribute it to a specific scribe. Of course, this attribution can be based on other information like the signature, colophon, historical data from the text itself, or other individual habits or scribal practices like the layout, a specific way to spell some words, or the lexicon, etc., and so on. Well, I took only one example here of a very well-known scribe, Kaner Khepeshev, who has this very recognizable, skillful handwriting, but still very, let's say, awful also, bent to the right, and which has been described by Gardiner. So it's one of the scribe we can identify his handwriting and his text, but we have others like the famous Amenard son of Pietri that Andreas Dorn and Stefan Polis have studied a lot this past few years. And for instance, also the scribe Jeuti Mose, which has been studied by Rob Desmarais. Back to my fragments in Turin, let's say, we just to show you a few fragments from the collection. Actually, from the el-Medina and belonging to the corpus of the Crossing Boundaries project, we have more than 12,000 fragments. So besides the few dozens or maybe hundreds of fragments that are well known and like this one, that were most of the time at least preliminarily published in the past. So full pages or huge papyri, sometimes measuring some meters. Besides that, we have hundreds, thousands of small fragments. So here you can see how it looks before restoration. And so in these folders, you can find a lot of fragments from various sizes, with, of course, a huge variety of handwriting, as you can see, and different kind of contents. So it's really full of different kind of things. So here you have some, let's say, not so small fragments. Here you have smaller fragments, and again smaller fragments. And here you can see that we begin to have tiny fragments that are sometimes more than 100 by folder. So it's really a huge puzzle to play with. After restoration, the fragment is considered as an object, and it has its own picture in higher resolution, and we can use also this kind of high resolution picture to check or just to make new joins when dealing with other fragments and with reconstruction. So I put some examples. On this one, I will come back to it also later. So you see, you can have really tiny things, and actually sometimes even those tiny things can be repositioned on larger fragments and joined to more or less larger fragments, let's say. Even if it's not very useful in terms of contents, it can be kind of new information, and it can lead to overjoins after. So I think even the tiny fragments should be at least tried once. Well, the first case study I want to discuss today is this text. So in fact, the right part of the plate, the 3 fragments you can see at the right part, which is, as we will see in a few minutes, a parallel to magical text in the verso of the Papyrus Chester Beatty 9, which is now in the British Museum. So these fragments, as you can see, so they are written on recto and written also on verso at the left. And actually it shows that probably they don't belong at all to the same document that the other one, which is not written in the verso. You can see the handwriting also is really different, and by the way the format also is completely different, because this is a quarter roll and this is an half roll of papyrus. What is interesting with this fragment is that you have, with 3 fragments you have here, some information about the materiality of a document in general. So it seems to be palimpsest. I mean, it is palimpsest. You can see here, for instance, really some signs that are readable under the current text. So it was erased, badly erased in the antiquity, and the scribe reused the papyrus. The text, the papyrus, the document is written on recto and verso. I already said it, and it has the same top-down orientation following vertical axis. So the scribe turned the roll following a vertical axis to write the text on verso, or vice versa. The handwriting, it's an half roll format, so we can see it's an half roll format because it's almost it's already more than 12 centimeters high, and when reconstructing the page, it goes to almost 20, a little less than 20, but anyway. So the handwriting looks at first sight literary, or at least not administrative, meaning it's fine and rather quick, with like strokes going straight to the left. Handwriting. It's probably the same handwriting on recto and verso, so I will come back to the other picture. But it seems to be really to have been written with a more careful hand on verso. So my guess is that it's the same handwriting, but the scribe did not write with the same tool, or not as quickly on both sides. But that's really also a kind of intuitive guess, and I still need to prove it. And it's slightly bent to the right, so I speak mainly about the handwriting on the recto here. And we have data about the contents because it was identified before by Alessandro Roccati, who worked a lot on this collection, the Turin collection, and who identified those fragments as parallel to text D and the verso of Chester Beatty 9. So here you have one of the plates, a glass plate in the British Museum with Chester Beatty 9, and the beginning of text D, just after the text C. So when I began to work on this fragments, actually I discovered this folder, and in this folder you can see that there are, let's say, I don't know, maybe 40 fragments, but some of them are sharing the same characteristic, the same general characteristic features that the document I'm commenting. So for instance, this one or this one, you have the palimpsest, you have the same also, well, the color of the papyrus itself is not always a reliable criterion, but it can be helpful sometimes. And actually sometimes also, so I only show here a side of the fragments, but you have a text also on the verso, or let's say verso and recto of the document are completely mixed here, so you can have both on the same plate. And I began to try to reconstruct the document, so it appears that it was possible to reconstruct at least this page with the beginning of the next page. Of course, it was so it was based originally of a shape on the shape of a signs on paleography. But in this case, there is a precious help because you can compare the text, of course, to the XIXth one. And so when you have these fragments, for instance, you look in the XIXth publication by, so here you have another image with a reconstruction, and everything in red is new fragments, and the other ones are the original from CGT 54, 57. So based on the original publication by Gardiner of the XIXth, you can find, of course, the position of the fragments, the relative position, more or less, of the fragments compared with the reconstruction you propose. So everything in green here is attested in Turin, in the Turin version I shown to you. Well, I didn't put all the fragments, but we have also tiny fragments like that, or small fragments, let's say, that all comes from different folders. So actually there are two bunch of fragments which come from two folders. Which means probably that they were pre-ordered by some scholar before, based on the handwriting or the general aspect, but without any join so far. And beside that, there are fragments in a lot of other folders across the collection. So maybe, I don't know, maybe 10 or 12 different folders, but for other papyri, it can be really more. So you see here also that even with some very lacunary pages, we can do something and try to reposition all the fragments. And even with this kind of fragments, which was alone for 6 months, and finally I discovered this position at some point. What is interesting with this case study is also that it's really obvious when you compare with the XIXth papyrus that the handwriting is exactly the same in our case, and this leads me to another question of methodology when using paleography to compare handwritings. So the traditional approach is more centered on the sign level, and all our paleographies are mostly based on the sign level, even if we have some really current groups with ligatures in most of our paleographies. But in fact, sometimes it's really useful also to compare a group of signs, so words and even group of words. Because of course the way the scribe will write the same group in two different documents can lead to connect those documents. Here I took two examples, but I could have taken other ones. I took swab and hu, and even hutu, because those are two expressions that we can find really everywhere in the text D, and so it's very frequent, very often attested, and you can see that we have a very close way to write the signs and the words. So, for instance, you can see that the web has this double almost loop and a very short straight of line of water here, and you can see here also. Even the S sign also has this kind of back part that you can see a bit here. Well, I mean, the picture itself is speaking. And in fact, if you compare the whole passage, let's say, or at least lines, so a larger sample, you can see also that it's very close to the Chester BT9 papyrus itself. So probably both versions were written by the same scribe. And of course, what is interesting is why he chose to write twice the same text, probably around the same time, and we don't know if it belongs to the same archive, but at least it was from the same site and from the same period. Well, I try to be a bit quicker, but what is interesting also with this version is that we have another group of fragments, which has the same inventory number originally, by the way. And this group of fragments is also a copy, or let's say another version of the Chester BT9 papyrus, but of the other magical texts in the verso, so text B and C. So you can see here that this fragments doesn't belong to the group because it is written on the verso. And you can see here my most, let's say, my last reconstruction of this fragments with a new fragment here, two new fragments here, and another one here, and the reorganization of the previous fragments. And actually, this part of the text corresponds to this text in the Chester BT9 version. So you can see also that it's exactly, or I mean, it's really a close layout with the end of the magical text here, the rubrum, and then a litany of God's name of invocations, what gardeners call the Book of Invocation. So on this drawing, you can see that the organization, the layout, the general layout is very close, except that there is a difference of format because the Chester BT9 is half roll, and this other version of Turin is probably a quarter roll based on the margins that are partly preserved, at least at the lower part, and also I think at the upper part of the document. What is interesting here is that you can also verify that both handwritings are very close, and in fact it leads me to another question about paleography, which is diagnostic science. We are used to consider that we have a kind of limited group of diagnostic signs that are the most often used in Egyptian. So, for instance, the Pa is the article Pa is a very famous one. But in fact, diagnostic science, at least in my case for reconstruction, is more is something totally. It can be whatever whatever kind of signs. I mean, it's here it's J7, so it's not the sign that you would say there are a lot of very recognizable variation, but when you are dealing with thousands of fragments and so on, at some point you can really quickly identify a variation of a G7 from another one. And of course, it's one of the most frequent sign in this text. So it's also the reason why you use it as a diagnostic sign, let's say a temporary diagnostic sign. So I gave you an example here. For instance, you have both of those fragments were totally separated and they don't belong at all to the same folder originally. But you can see that the shape of the G7 is very characteristic with this curved part, upper part. And for instance, here the diagnostic sign is just the most recognizable and the most frequent one. And I mean, it's at some point it's even a diagnostic sign is in fact based on the personal experience of the Egyptologist who is working on the material. I think. Well, we have also diagnostic groups here in Nigeru, and I think it's pretty convincing also that we have two versions written by the same scribe again, and here the rubrum on both documents. And finally, there is also a third fragment, which has really the same kind of, so here you can see that we have a list of epithet of the god Tut, and it belongs to the text C, the Book of Invocation. And here you can see that, well, I mean, at least you have to believe me, but the handwriting is again the same. It's very close, but the size of the signs and even the interlines is really smaller. So it leads to a question about variation and how maybe a scribe can write with the same handwriting, but in different size because of the context, because of the document itself, which doesn't allow to write in a larger way and so on, and how to know if it's the same scribe or different scribe writing with the same kind of handwriting, and who could belong to the same school, or let's say even a family of scribes who learned the same way to trace the signs and so on. But except if you have signatures on other individual data inside the contents, it's very difficult to say, of course. And here you can see a comparison between all the versions with the Ramesside group, which I think is also convincing to consider that it's the same scribe, or at least the same school of scribe. Well, the second example, and I will be quicker, the second example is based on, I mean, it comes from a main project, which is the study of a version of a satirical letter of Hori in Turin. So here you have one, which has been previously published by Caminos, but without any pictures. And in fact, I discovered more fragments, which joins most of them directly with those ones. And the verso is written with a necropolis journal with a very characteristic administrative handwriting from the end of the 20th dynasty. So it has very specific features at the level of signs, at least. You can see the Aleph, which has this very curved shapes, and actually it's something you can find in other signs, like in the A24, or even in the ligature here, in between the M and the Ain. And the Aleph has a very also sharp, let's say, back lower parts, which is something that really allowed me to make a lot of joins with other fragments for this specific papyrus. The shape of Yod also is a bit characteristic, with this kind of dot which is added to the main vertical part, and the very rounded upper part also. But you can see also that there are some inner variation in the handwriting of the scribe of this papyrus. And actually, if you, well, I don't have the time to show you the papyrus itself, but there are really some strong variation in between this part and this part of the document that I can't explain still, but I will try in the future. So I was looking for more fragments when I discovered this document, which is obviously a magical text. So a literary text first, and the magical one with red dots, and actually a very close handwriting to the one I showed just before. So if you compare, I mean, at right, you have some comparison with the signs from the satirical letter of Rory, and even if there are differences, I think some of the signs are really convincing. For instance, this ligature is very characteristic if you compare with this one, but the rush pen of the scribe seems to be a bit bolder, larger, the signs are larger, and so on. And in fact, if you compare other signs, you can see that there are strong differences also in between signs. So for instance, the aha, which is in red here, but anyway, it has a very different shape. And the su, especially the u itself, is really rounded in the satirical letter of Rory, and more let's say more quick and more strong in the other papyrus. If you compare the yod signs, also you have a very different way to draw the yod, but you can find also some very close way to draw it. So if you compare this yod and this other yod, they are both by the same scribe and from the same documents, and even probably the same page or the page just before. But you can see that there is this variation in between signs. So I was not sure that, and I'm still not sure, by the way, that it's the same handwriting, but the thing is that, yes, and here it's the verso. You can see it's another magical text with a very different handwriting. Yes, so I was looking for more fragments for a satirical letter of Rory, and finally I discovered isolated fragments that were close to the satirical letter of Rory version, but also close to this papyrus, this magical papyrus. And of course, they have other characteristic. So about the materiality, for instance, this text is punctuated, the satirical letter of Rory is not, and so on. And I was able finally to identify the magical kind of text, which is written here. It's a Gliedervergotung, so it's a text with well-attested parallels till from the Ramesside period till the Ptolemaic one. And the verso is unidentified magical medical text, but still completely different to the administrative ones from the satirical letter of Rory. Actually, there is also a very repetitive pattern in red, which is attested at least several times here and in other fragments. So finally, I had two complete different papyri, but with a common handwriting on the recto. And of course, my main problem was how to identify which can belong to the first one, and which fragment can belong to the first one, and which fragments can belong to second one. And all the criteria are listed here, of course. The only issue is when you have fragments without nothing on the verso and without punctuation or red ink. And in this case, you can check, of course, the satirical letter authority to be sure it's not a fragment of a text, but it's a text that potentially can have a lot of variation, even in the lexicon. And if a fragment is too tiny or not, let's say, it's only few signs, it's complicated to say to which papyrus it belongs. So this experience led me to consider that it was written by the same scribe, but maybe not at the same period of his career or whatever. And finally, I began also to reconstruct the magical text itself. So, for instance, here you have a fragment that I discovered in one of the folder. So, based on the handwriting, I was able to find another one here where you can find exactly the same expression here on it. And the verso handwriting are matching together also. And step by step, I was able to reconstruct this main pages. And I had, of course, more signs to compare with the satirical letter of Hori. Well, I'm still hesitating, but I really think that there is a kind of affiliation, or let's say a connection in between both handwritings. And it's very convincing based on the Aleph, and as I said, it's really one of the main diagnostic signs for both of those papyri, and even when is already closed. So finally, the reconstruction, the current reconstruction shows 3 pages, well, in red you can see that there is a breaking line that is also something interesting, because I use it to align these fragments to these ones and to propose a reconstruction with the end of a page here, of a column of text, let's say. Well, it's an hypothesis, but well, I think it till now it fits with what is expected in the text based on parallels of such Gliedervergotung. Here you have a verso, so it's exactly the same, of course, but you can see I added some fragments that are also attested before the recto, of course, but fragments that can't be repositioned because actually the recto is not clear enough to identify a passage of another magical, known magical text, and there are no direct join with the previous pages. So that's part of the job also, to keep aside these collected fragments to make the reconstruction better, maybe in the future with more fragments. So yes, you have 2 pages preserved here. And to finish, I just wanted to say a few words on TPUP itself, so the online database that will be open to the public in the next, maybe next year or in the next few years. Of course, we are trying to fill all the fields of the database at the object level, so for each fragment. But each fragment is also connected to a document ID number, which allows us to to group all the fragments belonging to a same document, or allegedly belonging to a same document. So it includes direct joins and also indirect joins, so fragments identified based on the handwritings and contents, with annotation, of course, and a huge work of puzzling. And in the future, a virtual reconstruction will accompany the document itself with other fragments together. What's next? Well, we still need to extend the corpus, of course, because the el-Medina papyri are split in many other collections, especially in the IFAO in Cairo. So we could find on there are already some direct joints between those collections. About handwritings, Ostraka are also a huge amount of data, and the same scribes are writing on Ostraka and on papyri, or at least that's what we expect, and what we can prove for some of them. And beyond the el-Medina, of course, the same kind of methodology can be used for each kind of corpus, except that, of course, to go further in the identification of scribes and so on, the el-Medina is really the best example we have, because we know very well the community during 2 centuries and so on. Clustering handwritings, so it's still something that needs to be done, or at least improved, to identify scribal repertoires, and to check if we can also identify transmission practices in the handwriting itself, from one scribe to another, from one master to an apprentice, and maybe inside families. And also this will improve our datations, because if you can attribute a handwriting to a scribe, which is well attested in the el-Medina documentation, and well dated, this means you can date after that at least basically the documents inside the 2 dynasties that are that corresponds to the Ramesside period. And another interesting point is to collect a maximum of data for further semi-automatic analysis work using machine and IT science, but I will keep this for another day. Well, to conclude, there is still work on Turin papyrus, and of course on the corpus from the el-Medina in general, as said Alessandro Roccati himself. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Renaud. Very interesting presentation, and also huge work. I don't know if there. So we are a bit over time, but if there are any questions, please raise your hand, and then I will give you